because we are suffering as a race is because at large we don't know our history. Don't get mad when people don't tell you about your history. You have Google, you have libraries. It is up to us to teach our children and ourselves our history.
Well, we're at the end of February, and it has been known as Black History Month. A thing that we started celebrating back in 1976. I have a couple of questions for my guest, and I tell you what, I'm so proud to be able to call him my friend. My guest is Dr. Uzziah Harris. He is the head of the Culpeper branch of the NAACP. First off, good morning, Dr. Harris.
Good morning, Brother Slade. Thank you so much for having me, man.
All right, so I guess I was actually inspired because I did the news story first when it first came out, and then I've redone it again because it's going to air on Monday. The question that that your essay contest asked is a question that people are asking all over the place. Do we still really need a Black History Month?
Yes, absolutely we do. And, there are a couple of reasons for that. Both of them center around dispelling ignorance. When a people understands where they come from, when a people are able to acknowledge their own accomplishments, that engenders a sense of pride. It gives them a backdrop that propels them to future success, but also, and just as importantly, it allows those around them to see their accomplishments as well and begin to respect them in a different light. And I think that part of what's going on in our country, to be quite honest, is there has not been enough focus. The fact that we have to have a Black History Month out of the 12 months of the year should say enough. And so when people don't know anything other than persons were descendants from enslaved Africans, and the history doesn't go beyond that or didn't go before that, then that would explain why there's so much ignorance. And this is, I think, also what bothers me, Brother Slade, as it relates to some of the hype and misconception around the entire CRT argument, right? So we're in Virginia, we got to talk about it, right?
This is, again, this conversation is probably going to make some people uncomfortable because it's going to be a lot of truth explained, and it's going to be probably hard-hitting and unable to be digested easily. But yes, critical race theory. Briefly explain to me, because I'm trying to make sure I understand it, because it's like, number one, I never had the project, I never had the class when I was in grade school or high school, but we started to touch on it when I was in college.
Yes.
So just break it down, critical race theory.
So critical race theory, and it's interesting that you said you never heard about it in grade school, but you touched on it when you got to college. And that's because critical race theory is a college discipline. It has never been taught in elementary, high school, or middle school, at least in Virginia, right? And so since we're Virginians, we got to talk about it to some degree because you look at your General Assembly legislation and you're seeing a whole bunch of things related to quote unquote divisive topics. So CRT is a college discipline, a theory that studies the way racism, right? The way discrimination is embedded into our institutions, our systems, right? Government, banking or finance, policing, any number of different institutions, how racism has found its way into those institutions and how that negatively affects African-American people and people of color in this country.
But Dr. Harris, what are you talking about? There's no such thing as racism. We've done away with racism ever since, at least 2000.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's probably what is the most comical, right? I think the biggest barrier to us being able to kind of touch on racism is that we never want to talk about racism.
It becomes a very uncomfortable subject for people, and I'm fortunate because I hang out with a lot of liberals, so it's like, again, it does become a topic of discussion. But you don't have to be a blind man to realize that we're in trouble here. And I mentioned before we started recording, I was 8 years old when Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech was done, and some 60 years later, we're still looking at the same problems. The same questions. Now, of course, it's a lot more hidden than it was because the blatancy just doesn't work anymore. Now it's like we got to do things on the sly and on the side. And that is another problem that faces people of color.
Well, it didn't work being that blatant, I guess, until 2016. But
there you go.
What I will say is I think that's a great segue because Martin King, I Have a Dream, 1963. Martin King, 1968, that dream has turned into a nightmare. Not my words, King's words. You can go back and see it quoted. My dream has turned into a nightmare. I feel as if I have led my people, in terms of integration, into a burning house. Again, not my words, King's words. And it's because you can look at what people say. You have the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. Right? We were able to abolish slavery. We were able to make sure if you were born in the United States, you are an American citizen, considered an American citizen. You are able, if you were a black male, because only white males at the time could vote, you are able to vote, right? You look at 64 Civil Rights Act, 65 Voting Acts, right? 68, 70-ish Fair Housing Rights Act, first African-American president, Barack Obama. And it falls in line with the narrative that I believe is so deleterious to our society that we have just progressed so far. And yet, numbers don't lie. We had more political representation of black people during Reconstruction than we do today. The wealth gap in this country is just as wide as it has always been.
When the top 1% controlled 90% of the wealth, yes, there's the picture. It's just as plain as day.
So how can we argue for a progression, if you will, that only includes the fact that now, instead of you putting me in the back of your restaurant, you let me come in the front of your restaurant, take my money, and still treat me in a manner that is subhuman to some degree. I think until we get to the place where we're able to say, listen, this country is a great nation. My grandfather fought for this country. My great-grandfather fought for this country. My dad was in the military, career military man. I love this country. This is the only country that I have ever known in terms of being, a part of for the majority of my life. My dad's military career took us overseas, but America is what I know. But at the same time, when America was founded, America is founded dualistically on two different prongs. The supremacy of a white male, right, which is why women weren't able to vote, as well as this notion of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for who? And so until we're able to understand that it has always been the goal of a few to enrich themselves at the expense of other people, then we're not going to be able to truly make recompense to folks who have been so easily dismissed and discriminated against to the tune of 400 years.
And that's a lot of time to try and recap anything. We started this diatribe because it's like the NAACP, it's got young people involved because it's like that's where it's going to have to come from. We're going to have to start retraining our young people to understand their history. So you've got this essay contest going on. What are you looking for in the essay?
So we are, quite frankly, just looking for persons to write, and really, I'll be honest with you, they don't have to write it. They can actually send videos to our NAACP page describing the importance of Black history and whether or not it is still necessary. And I think this is crucially important because, again, we live in a society that is so quick to dismiss the stain of racism. And I get it. None of us want to continually look at things that are untoward as it relates to ourselves.
But on a personal note, it's like, the whole idea of personal responsibility, it takes its place there. And the thing of it is that it's not going away. And I think that people have the wrong idea that, all this uproar about tearing down statues and such is to make history go away. No, it isn't. It is to make history wide open and make you understand this is why this is happening. Everything wasn't cherries and roses, man. It's like there were some bumps along the road. Sometimes they had to be done, and other times it was a choice. So, I think that knowing history is, of course, if those who fail to learn are bound to repeat it. So we're trying to get the next generation of children to understand Because, like I say, we are proud people. We have accomplished a great deal, and there's still more to come. And all we have to do is not get depressed about it.
This is what I find interesting, Brother Slade. Well, when we talk about things such as the tearing down of statues, for me, I just think that, you probably need to put them in a more appropriate place. You probably can find Nazi memorabilia in Germany. It's just not in the public square as if it were celebrated. And I find it hard sometimes that it's not put in the proper context. We say we celebrate Civil War history, but you have far more Confederate representation than Union representation. And this is what this means, essentially, that we are celebrating those who were at war with the United States of America. And people need to begin to ask the question, why is it so important for me to continue to have Lee in front of my face and not have Grant in front of my face?
In fact, as a matter of fact, just recently, it was discovered that there were hundreds of black soldiers who actually came through Culpeper for Robert E. Lee. And, again, when did you hear that? Oh, last week. Yeah. And that's what's missing. History is not complete unless you tell the whole story.
Yes, sir.
And that's where we're getting a lot of Eurocentric history, and it's like, and it has to be, history is history. Good, bad, or ugly. We've got to accept what happened. It's like it happened. Now, the only thing we can do is avoid it from happening again.
That's right. And so when they talk about, particularly those who are proponents who are, quote unquote, so-called anti-CRT, when again, I got to reiterate, CRT does not take place in our public school system. What they really mean is we don't want to talk about some of the, as you said, uglier points of our history in the hopes of learning from it. In other words, the persons who were spitting in the face of black children trying to integrate into school don't want their grandchildren to know that they were the ones spitting in the face of black children. But again, we have no problem with indoctrination when it's Christopher Columbus discovered America, a place where people were already living, and even according to his journal, people had already traversed and traveled across the Atlantic Ocean to get there. I digress. We have no problem with indoctrination when we're talking about how Abraham Lincoln had such a love for black people that he was willing to do whatever he could to free them, versus he was doing whatever he could to keep the Union intact. We have no problem with indoctrination when the history is a history that favors a false narrative.
I brought that up, and I'm going to go ahead and clear up that whole issue because, again, yes, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation as a step to free the slaves, but there was an ulterior motive because he needed soldiers. He needed lots of soldiers. He needed big, strapping black soldiers to come and help fight, and that was the bottom line reason for it. I said that to someone, and they looked at me like I was crazy. But those are the facts, and those are the facts that are not revealed. Yes. Again, tell me the truth. Don't lie to me about history because it's like it comes back to bite you. My mother was a history major, so that's why again it's like that. Now let me ask you the competition for this essay. I'm kind of hoping that maybe parents will help these kids help to write it or speak it because it's like they're going to have to depend on knowledge from another generation to be able to speak on what's going on and what they'd like to see in their dreams and aspirations. So,
well, I think that that's part of the beauty of one knowing one's history, right? If we go back to a more Afrocentric model versus a Eurocentric model, we were storytellers culturally. We handed stories down to the next generation. And part of the unity in or between our generations, intergenerationally, was because we told stories. Or as it said in the Bible, I continue to rehearse these things that my people may not forget where they came from. Use these stones as a memoriam so you can see where I carried you from. I think part of the disconnect in our community from an intergenerational standpoint is that we don't sit down and talk about history. Everybody thinks, whether it's millennials, Xers, boomers, whatever generation, thinks that they are isolated in and of themselves on this Western hemisphere trying to make it. And how much stronger would we be if we got back to the place of coalescence, seeing each other as a community, and realizing we actually needed all of each other to propel forward.
I have to tell you, Dr. Harris, I moved here in 1970, and schools had just integrated 2 years earlier. So I'm coming from a city that's 45 minutes from New York. I don't know anything about riding in the back of the bus. I don't know anything about different schools where different people. It's like, as a matter of fact, and I went to parochial schools, and that was high dog. When I came down here, it's like there was still a lot of that under your breath racism. There were still people who, they had those white sheets that they didn't put on the bed. Again, and it's like, and I came down here with my city ways, and it's like, and I just made friends with people. And down the road, there was a family. I won't say their name in case they're still around, but there were three teenage white girls, and I played guitar. So I brought them to my house, and we were out in my yard, and I'm just playing and singing songs and such. My great Aunt Jo was living at the house. When my mom came home from work, she just jumped her right off the bat. Oh, he's gonna have them KKK burn our house down. Blah, 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 blah. I never heard of such things. I mean, it's like, I was naive enough because we hadn't studied things like that just yet because it was going to be coming, but I just found it incredible that people could be so cruel over something that I didn't have anything to do with, and it's like, and that's where racism gets under my skin. If you're gonna dislike me because I did something to you, I said something to you. Dislike me because you don't like what I do on the air, but don't dislike me because of the color of my skin. I used to have lots of questions about it because, number one, there was a long time that people did not know that I was a man of color because I don't speak like that. I speak so clearly.
Yes, sir. So articulately.
Yes. And so, again, then I had a general manager of a station I was working at tell me, you should send your picture with your resume so that they have an idea that no, that's not what I'm selling it on. You either like what you hear or you don't. If you don't like what you hear, it doesn't matter what you see. And I've always lived by that philosophy. And I've been lucky here because, a lot of firsts. A lot of firsts. First morning guy. Longest reigning morning guy in the history of 70 years of this radio station. First program director. I mean, but it's because I didn't let it get in my way. And I wasn't going to use it as my shield. It's like I just worked harder and showed that I could do the job. And as long as you do that, eventually it does pay off, but it's a lot harder than it was for me. That's for sure.
And I'm glad you brought that up because what the crux of that particular narrative shows us is racism, discrimination, bigotry, all of the above is a learned behavior, right? Race in and of itself is a social construct, right? It's not necessarily a genetic fact, a biological fact. It is a social construct. With that said, if racism can be learned, right? As we can watch children in elementary school play regardless of color, regardless of what political party their parents are in, then if racism can be learned, then it can be unlearned. The fight is hard. It's inconvenient, right, to some, but it can be unlearned. And I think the hope is that we can coalesce with enough persons, whether they be on the other side of the political aisle, whether they be another color, whether they be of another religious affiliation or no religious affiliation at all, that we can come together and say, this is the society we want, and this is the society we push for. I think that there is a misnomer out there as it relates to what we want as a community, Brother Slade. I'm going to be honest with you. African-American people that I come across don't want handouts. African-American people that I come across don't even really want laws to have to be made for them. They understand the reality that they live in. What they would rather have is a situation where, because everything is on the up and up, where there is true equity, where there is true merit, that there would be no need for such laws. Unfortunately, the reality is that we are not there. Take a look at something as recent as at the beginning of the Biden presidency, if you will, how easy it was for the Asian hate crime bill to be passed through Congress. Now, again, I don't say anything demeaning toward my Asian brothers and sisters. My Asian brothers and sisters are just as important to me as my white brothers and sisters are just as important to me as my purple or whatever. They're all my brothers and sisters. But let's look at the facts. It has been far easier to get that passed when we have a history of statistical data and now photo evidence in this new social media, Instagram, TikTok, whatever age we live in, and yet we can send money to Ukraine. We can agree, bipartisan agreement, that millions of dollars, it is in the best interest of the United States of America. What about the people who live, sweat, bleed, and die in this country? What about the people? Because you had no problem giving reparations for Asian people for the atrocities, and they were atrocities committed, putting them in internment camps. You had no problem, even though it was small in comparison to the crime, no problem giving reparations to my indigenous brothers for pushing them into the Pacific Ocean to die. But for some, you had no problem giving money back to slave owners at the conclusion of the war because of, quote unquote, property loss. But we look at the descendants of enslaved Africans today, having followed the history of institutional slavery, forced servitude, having looked at the peonage system that morphed into the prison pipeline, which is a for-profit system, having seen the disparities in education that have existed even from the time that they were enslaved people and you killed them for trying to read, having known that you have only given them political empowerment for really the past, I would guess, from 60, 65, 70-ish years, if you will.
Yeah.
And there is something inherently inside too many Americans that says, we don't owe them anything. Do you know what reconciliation really means biblically?
It's just to come together. It brings people together, yes.
That's a Webster's dictionary definition. And Brother Slade, you are so astute, so smart. Thank you for throwing that out there because I didn't know the Webster's definition. The biblical definition of reconciliation is exchange, to restore someone to a place of favor. So what reconciliation means, first reconciliation, the prefix re meaning again, first it assumes that there were amicable and equitable relationships before. So it has to first assume that there was a point in United States history where you and I, as melanated brothers, shared a sense of favor and love that was commensurate to our less melanated brothers. Okay, that's the first thing. But the second thing is it also assumes that the payment, the recompense, is equal to the pain inflicted and brings us back to a place of favor. And that has never happened in this country.
Dr. Harris, do you know the standard formula? It's one of the few things that I learned about when I was in algebra, about proof. You have a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. If either one is wrong, you obviously can't come up with the correct conclusion.
Yes, sir.
And that's exactly where we are in this conundrum. I start, as I get older, it's like I start feeling like I'm starting to sound like the old folks did when I was a kid.
Yes, sir.
But, there are some things that we are missing. Number one, and modern technology isn't helping us. With every time you look some of these faces in a screen, instead of sitting around talking to each other. And we're losing that generation that can give us the best hint on how we can continue to make it, because they're dying on a rapid pace every day. And that's why I appreciate older folks, because they're that knowledge. Again, I joke about it. It's like, because, once the old folks are gone, women ain't going to be able to cook because they don't know how to make anything out of a box, Sorry, I just assaulted women. I'm sorry. But there again, you understand, Dr. Harris, that we have got to, how can we get back? I know that the NAACP is a great organization. And we used to, of course, it used to be church, because church was the place that kept us all steady. What do we do?
That's good, because what you're mentioning are activism groups, community groups, churches, what is their current responsibility? Juxtaposed to what they've done in the past, what is their responsibility? And I think that it is important that what we realize is, from today's standpoint, activism isn't just sending a post. I'm not an activist based on the number of likes I have or commentary I have on any particular post. Activism is much more than a march. That change is really defined by one thing. Has it changed?
Yeah.
Is it different, right? And so if you want to talk about change, then change is measured quite easily. Change is measured in how more black kids are going to school, how less black kids are born into poverty or out of wedlock, how more top Fortune 500 companies have black CEOs, how there are more small privately owned businesses, how the graduation rate has increased and the dropout rate has decreased. These are very clear predictors that let us know whether or not there has been change. What the church, what the NAACP, what other community organisms have to do is begin to push back into our communities, reach out and touch our communities, and have some authentic conversations and create some authentic opportunities that lend themselves around those particular points. What can we do to help black males who may be fatherless? How can we mentor them through a very rough time in middle school, through high school? How can we provide as the church who pulls together some $1 billion, $2 to $3 billion even, on any given Sunday when you look at all the churches together? Why are those finances not put back into the community to help smart kids who are motivated, who want to go to college, help them get to college? Why aren't we doing more as it relates to before and after school care for our single black mothers who are holding it down so that they can go to work and realize that while they're at work, there is someone who is nurturing and pouring into their children until they get home? We have to do more. Martin King said it like this, not quoted verbatim, but the spirit of it. We need more leaders who are concerned about the cause and not concerned about the coin. We have become such a Eurocentric model as it relates to, collectivism, right? We used to say a village raised a child. Now
It's $1 billion for the village.
we must come back to the place where we are talking and having these dialogues. When you were growing up, it probably wasn't uncustomary for a doctor and a teacher and a sanitation worker to live in the same neighborhood.
Same neighborhood.
Today.
That's where I came from. And it's like this division. Economic division is another thing that is just, it's tearing us apart.
Yes.
Again, and I understand, you want to talk and raise about minimum wage to $15 an hour, but I also point out the problems that's going to cause. Because, listen, I know McDonald's will probably hire everybody they can, but at $15 an hour, they're going to have to start thinking, well, we're either going to have to raise the price of our burgers or we're going to have to do this with less people. And which decision do you think they're going to make?
Yeah, not only
Probably both.
not only that, but think about it. If you raise it to $15 an hour, now the person who may have just come out of high school, now they are competing against someone else that perhaps has some college experience, because $15 an hour isn't bad.
It ain't bad.
So you're right, it creates a whole number of issues. But again, I think the bigger problem is our own lack of community autonomy, the idea that our destiny is somehow intrinsically tied to someone else's benevolence. And what I've observed in this country is that persons who, quote unquote, do for themselves, or who are able to float by themselves, are then more easily welcomed in the fold, quote unquote, than those persons who look like they need someone else to survive. That just isn't the way our, quote unquote, capitalistic democracy works. It seems to be something a little different.
Dr. Harris is like, the time goes so quickly and we are just about out of time. But I really want you to come back on this program, because it's like, I think these are issues that if we can start the conversation and get people to at least start thinking. I mean, I'm not going to eat your children, I promise. It's like, again, if you sit down and talk to me, I think you'll find that I'm a pretty intelligent human being. So, and I think that's where we got to start. Stop assuming that I'm stupid. I'm not stupid, and I have never been stupid. I won't be stupid. But what would you say as a final thought?
I would say that we have to understand, as Martin King understood, we will either coexist together as brothers, or we will perish together as fools. And I don't think there has been enough emphasis on how the stain of racism, discrimination, bigotry, hate has affected our entire country. Sure, the discrimination has had multiple disastrous effects upon the African American community. But as an aggregate, as a whole, it's had a great effect on our country as well. We can see our country disintegrating right before our very eyes. And unless we realize we are in this together and that we must begin to live much truer to our creed, then the United States of America will always be a misnomer, because there can be no unity without true repentance. There can be no unity without true love. There can be no unity without a concerted effort to want to be unified.
I am not understanding why. That made absolute perfect sense to me, and it's a very perfect roadmap to travel. Dr. Uzziah Harris, thank you so very much for being on the program.
Bless
And
you,
I
sir.
am going to ask you back again, because we're going to talk about this, because I think that if we don't do anything else in 2022, we've got to start knocking down these barriers, knocking down these doors, and hopefully you'll help me do that.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Bless you. I appreciate it.
All right, that is Local Issues Real.